Hello, I'm going to run through the Chapter 9 homework. This is on economic growth. It'll be a chance to dig into a couple things that we maybe barely touched upon. I've mentioned a couple times, I think this chapter is pretty light, so I'm going to handle it that way. I'm going to do a video for each question to help with streaming and downloading and uploading and all of that. So I'll start with question 9.4. 9.4 goes something like this. It gives us a table. Consider the following data. What is the per capita real GDP in each of these categories? One thing I'm not sure that I've mentioned, but I know it's in your book, and it's just as simple as this. The economist's best view of country's standard of living is this measure that we're finding. Real GDP per capita. Because you can have a large population such as China and have a huge economy such as China, but still have low GDP per capita such as China because of that huge population. So on average, China's standard of living does not compare to the US's standard of living. I mean, it can be compared, but ours is significantly higher. Our GDP is roughly the same as China's GDP, but our population is about, if I remember correctly, about a quarter of China's GDP. So our GDP per capita is much higher, just using those two countries as an example. And to answer this question, then, what I've done is set up the same table. There's only one thing I think that's challenging about this question, and I tried to make it a different color and note it here. If you look at the table, the population was in millions. So here in purple, what I've indicated is this was our GDP in the table was in billions. So in purple, what I've indicated is that I've changed this to millions also. So everything now is in millions. How many millions are in a billion? 1,000 millions are in a billion. Let that sink in, right? So again, going back to stock and flow variables, big numbers, they don't have a lot of meaning to us. And this is part of why we think of a billion as the next thing over a million. Well, in a way it is, but it's 1,000 millions in a billion. What that means for us here is in the table, it was listed as 55, but it was billions. If there are 1,000 millions in a billion, you just add 3 zeros to the end of it to convert it to millions. So that's what I did. And I did that up front. You could have divided 55 by 10 and then added the 3 zeros. That would work too. I just thought this was a good way to discuss that. So for letter A, that's exactly what we do. We divide, if it's per capita GDP, capita is a fancy way to say per person. We need fancy things like that so people like me have job security. So if your GDP, the size of your economy is 55,000 millions or 55 billion, so you take the 50, keeping everything in millions, that's 55,000 over 10, and that's 5,500. So that's the GDP per capita is 5,500 for letter A, for country A and letter A in the questions. Now, this also can give me a chance to highlight something I think I mentioned once. GDP per capita is the economist's best view of country standard of living, but that figure right there doesn't tell us anything about how that's distributed. That's like an average of the output per capita. We don't know that there's any one person whose standard of living is exactly 5,500 a year. We don't know that. It could be this. In other words, this doesn't tell us about the distribution of the country's output, which is something in the textbook that we mentioned, but this is kind of why. Now the next one is, I can go quicker. If we have 60,000 millions divided by 20 million, then it's 60,000 divided by 20, and that is going to be 6,000. No. Yeah, I doubled the bottom, sorry. 3,000. I was trying to use this as a reference. Let me make sure, yeah. So the standard of living in this country is less than in this country, on average. This country only has 5 million people in it, but its economy's size was 70 billion or 70,000 million. So letter C, 70,000 divided by 5, is 14,000, and I'm out of space, 14,000 per person on average. So which country has the highest standard of living? One thing that is a little misleading about this is that it's the one that has the highest real GDP, but it's not this that is the reason why this country has the highest standard of living, is it? It's this. Because this country has a higher GDP, country B has a higher GDP than country A, but notice country B, our GDP per person is much lower than country A. It's because they have twice the population. So dividing those goods and services around across more people, if things were shared equally in some way, would mean a lower share per person. So that's about all I can say about 9.4.